access to the manual score sheet. If any of the counties are using the manual LOC score sheet, we have learned that social workers cannot do math. So we are going to require that you use the digital form only so that there are no problems with calculating that score on the scoring sheet. So we will be taking down that SOCH 500 form off of the website, so you're no longer will be using the manual digital form. I mean the manual form, so you'll use that digital form only. We feel like these changes should not or will not affect the SCI plans. There were some concerns about if we were changing the tool too much, if that would change anything with respect to what counties were putting into their specialized care increment plans. The changes that we're making, we think will not impact those plans. So have no fear and don't panic. Take a deep breath. If you already submitted your SCI plans, you're good. As I said, these fixes that we're making to the tool, we think will provide more clarity. So the static indicator criteria has caused a lot of confusion. We've got a lot of questions around how that's being applied. So the static factors were created to allow counties to place young persons that might present with certain risk factors. And you know, if you recall from that list, we listed categories like CSEC populations, kids that were fire setters, had sex offender histories. You know, they had those risk factors within the prior 12 months of their placement. So the idea, thinking that, you know, they needed a special placement at that rate because of those risk factors or histories, and it would allow you as a county to determine if that was still a risk factor for those young folks, and whether or not, you know, if you stabilize that placement, then it may indicate you don't necessarily need that high rate for that individual. So that was the purpose of giving you 60 to 120 days to either make a better assessment about the supervision needs for the kids or what the placement needs might be, other than what the rate would be. There could be other things that the youth may need that's not necessarily directed toward the rate. So that was the whole reason for giving you 60 to 120 days to make that determination. So the static is not intended to be an automatic pathway to get the intensive service foster care rate. That, you know, we have a current policy exception in place, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in the later. But what I mean by that is that there seems to be a perception in the field that if you're a static factor, if you qualify for that static factor, that you're automatically entitled to retain that rate as an intensive service foster care placement. That is not the intention of the static factor criteria. It is a short-term rate option to cover these list of categories of children that we feel have risk factors that when you place them on a short-term basis, you're allowed to pay that high rate, and you are also expected to put services and supports in that placement if you're engaging that caregiver in the placement. That caregiver that resource parent may either be the short-term placement, or if you determine that resource parent is going to be the long-term placement, you'll make that determination after you've looked at the whole 360-degree factor of the kid. You've looked at the assessments, you've looked at their prior history, you're looking at the strengths of the resource parent, and at that point, you're making a determination if this kid, now you will conduct your level of care protocol tool, and then determine if the kid is truly an ISFC child or if they need a lower level care rate determination. That's the intention of the static criteria. So those of you that say, oh, I have a kid who's static, so they are entitled to ISFC, no, wrong, that's not it. That is not the pathway to ISFC. Now, right now, we have a current policy exception in place, and what that policy exception is that we are allowing all folks that are now at a static criteria level and receiving the ISFC rate They're on a holding pattern right now, and we're not allowing that rate to be lowered using the LOC tool until we can examine the characteristics of kids that are in that particular static criteria, and also we're looking at kids that are also as well as qualifying as intensive service foster care rate level, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. So you don't have to know static. You can have a child or youth with those risk factors who you realize what the supports are needed. You already have identified the supports that are needed for that youth, and you can make that placement, and you can do an LOC. It's either one or the other. It's either a static criteria or you do an LOC. You're not doing a static and an LOC at the same time. And I think we've seen some confusion around that piece where folks are checking the static box and then doing an LOC at the same time. So you either do the static short term and you skip doing an LOC while you use your 60 to 120 days to figure out what you're going to do and what that child needs for that placement. Or you don't opt to do static because you have enough information that you know about that youth that you can go straight to doing an LOC and you conduct that LOC. So that is the clarity I wanted to make about the static criteria, so I hope that's helpful.
So again, you cannot do static at the same time as the LOC.
You cannot do the static at the same time you do an LOC. It's either one or the other. At the end of your 60 to 120 days, you will do an LOC determination, because then you would have figured out with that child that you didn't have the initial information on, that you now have enough now to conduct the LOC determination. So it's either one or the other. So I think folks are being confused, like I have a static kid, he's at that rate, he's going to stay at that rate, and he's not done an LOC at all, so you're going to keep him in static forever. That is not the intent of static factor criteria. So the intent is to either use the LOC and determine if the kid is really in need of the ISFC rate or other LOC levels. Keeping in mind, all of the rate determinations in this structure, as we said, are centered around the expectations of the resource parent. So you can have a high needs kid and a resource parent that says, I am not interested in doing all of those interventions or doing behavior plans with this youth, but I'm going to let the kid stay here in my home. You county will need to determine, when you do an LOC rate determination, that parent most likely will not rate up to the ISFC level and qualify for that higher rate determination. But you county will be putting other services in that home. It could be wraparound, it could be the mental health ICC services, which is the intensive care coordination, or the in-home based intensive home-based services, and that caregiver is not the one that's really engaged in providing the intervention, but there are other folks that are providing those supports. Does not mean that that intensive services foster care rate goes to that caregiver. So those are some of the things that we think are important to look at when you have to look at the whole 360 degrees of what we have put in place for CCR. What I mean by that is that you have child and family teaming, you have your assessment processes, you have other things that go along with just the rate determination to figure out what supports and services are needed to support that resource family and also support the youth. So to do the LOC in isolation is not the intent. It's sort of like fidelity to make the LOC work, is that you have to have all these other components in place at some level or some level of intensity for it to really be effective.
Can we take a question?
Sure.
So if you give static criteria, can you lower it within the first year?
Okay, so that question indicates to me if they didn't get what I said the first time. Mm-hmm. Because the static criteria is short term. So you wouldn't be holding static for a whole year. You have 60 to 120 days. And at the end of that 120 days, you're supposed to do an LOC. So you don't, so use your 60 days because you have a youth that you're still trying to figure out what's going on with that youth. You still may be trying to figure out if this is going to be the permanent placement for that youth, and if this is just a short-term placement for that youth. But you got a willing caregiver. You need to determine if that's a long-term placement or a short-term placement. So static will be eventually lowered, or it may not. If the LOC tool indicates that this kid still is an ISFC kid, then that's the rate that you'll continue to pay based on what the level of care determination tool outcome is. So to the individual that asked that question, if you're in thinking that static is for a year, it wouldn't be static. It would be whatever that rate is. If it's an ISFC rate, that would be ongoing for a year. And then, or if there's a triggering event once we implement. Now, right now, we're in a holding pattern of lowering rates, but at the end of this extension period, we will reinstitute the policy that you can lower the rate. We just wanted to take an opportunity to really look at the tool, look at some of the characteristics of the kids that are getting static and ISFC to make sure that the tool is doing what it's intended to do. Because what we were hearing from the field is that when they conducted the LOC, some of these you got a lower level of care determination, and folks were concerned that high intensive use were in basic. And to those comments, I would say those are the cases that we're looking at, that if you got an intensive kid that's in basic, we need to understand how that's occurring. And we need to make sure that you were doing the tool correctly, or you either had the right information, or you understand the role of the resource parent in the care and supervision of that particular youth is what drives that rate determination. So I think some of the concepts of intensive services and supports and what's needed for the youth and the resource parent's role and the role of the agency and the FFA are things that I think that we are trying to tease out in policy and practice. So we have gotten all of your scenarios that you've sent to us, and those are the things that we are looking at now. The scenarios have come from the counties, and they have come from the FFAs around this whole static and ISFC piece. So I just wanted to make clear that right now we're in this holding pattern about not lowering the rate for static and ISFC, only for a short-term period. It will not continue to be the ongoing policy that you cannot lower that rate. In our previous letters, the policy was that you can, all rates will be all levels from 1 through 4, from the basic level 1 through 4, the policy that those rates would not be lowered during the first year. That was the initial policy. And then we always said that ISFC would be a rate that would be lower because we would expect that that level of intensity would not necessarily always continue for those kids, especially around the mental health needs that may not necessarily be true for kids that have medical or specialized healthcare needs. Some of those, or since those are physical needs that are ongoing, they don't necessarily titrate down. So it really depends on a case-by-case basis in terms of how we're looking at ongoing use of that rate. So are you seeing any more questions about that? Yes.
Okay. But can I put everyone on hold? There's a lot of questions about this, so I'd like to field these questions to make sure that they were not answered already by what you were saying. So I'm going to put everybody on hold for just a second. Okay.
All right, so back on again. So the questions that we're seeing in the chat box are about intensive service foster care. I'll get to that later in the presentation. So you may get your questions answered there. So I'm going to tell you to hold tight for a minute. Just announce that we will have a services only letter, either hopefully you post today or Monday. This letter establishes a rate that can be used for counties for short-term supports and services for youth that are either transitioning from higher levels of care to prevent disruption or to provide tangible supports. It's to be used with FFAs or other community-based organizations. It's a rate that's not to be supplanted, but supplement on top of other rates. Counties can either contract or use an MOU or develop your service agreement with an agency for the services that you're contracting for with this rate. And we have had some suggestions that the state work on a type of service agreement for the services only rate, and we're willing to do that. So we'll be reaching out to counties to help us with that piece. The idea for this is basically grounded similar to the way wraparound works, where you have a flexible fund to use appropriately for you. But we are targeting this so that it can accelerate the stepping down of you primarily. If there's some way that you need to fill a gap with this rate, then you can use that rate to do that. So stay tuned for that letter to come out shortly. Got other ACLs coming out on our regular CNIs are coming out. AAP is working right now. We're working with AAP to adapt a level of care tool for AAP families and workers. So you can direct your questions right now to the AAP policy staff, Martha Platt, but there'll be more instructions about LOC and AAP coming out too in the future. I want to talk a little bit about this leveling up policy. So we had a leveling up policy that we instituted to address or respond to what we were hearing from the field, that intensive needs kids were not getting the ISFC rate. And there were agencies that felt like kids needed that rate in order to provide that service. So as you recall, so technically we had two ways that you could level up the rate, and then we added this one. The leveling up scoring of 7, what it did was the 7, if you scored a 7 in the behavioral and emotional domain or in the health domain, it allows you to level up the families to the ISFC rate. And so right now, I would imagine that the question for a lot of the agencies, and we've seen questions like, I've done a self-determination using the LOC process, me, self being FFA agency, and my kid rated a 7 in the behavioral health domain. Should I go back to the county and request an ISFC rate? Okay, so my response to that is that the LOC rate determination can only be done by the county social worker or the probation officer. So FFA should not be doing the LOC rate determination tool. And there's reasons for that. I mean, the rate determination process was set up for counties to work in conjunction and partnership with you, agencies, resource parents, if you're doing the teaming, to make those rate determinations. But this temporary policy was allow us, as I said earlier, to understand the tool is doing what it's intended to do at that level. We right now put the policy in place also so that you can't reduce the rate. So folks are in a holding pattern on that. We expect to, as I said earlier, to change that policy and go back to the original policy if we determine that the tool is doing what it's intended to do, that you will be able to reduce the rate if that level of supervision or supports is no longer required by the resource parent. So because at this point, we don't feel the score of 7 alone can be the sole indicator of meeting ISFC. There's other factors. You should be looking 360 degrees, as I said, in a teaming ability or a teaming model. No matter how small or big your team is, there should be some relationship and discussion about what's happening with this youth, the resource family's capability and capacity, the assessments that you're doing, mental health at the table. All of those factors are what determine what occurs with the rate determination. Just because you could have a kid in a 7, we've been hearing that kids get a 7 and they have 1s in all the other domains. But we have questions about those, because typically kids that have really high intense behavioral needs also have needs happening in other domains. They usually have issues with school, and this is not the state talking. This is sort of what we heard from the counties, that you can't, have a kid that have high intense emotional behavioral needs and not have some of the other needs also being higher. So we're looking at those factors. We're interested in your feedback and engagement on that. And at some point at the end of this 30-day period, we'll have a decision about that piece and the ability to go back to the policy to reduce. I've heard on the strength side that some counties felt like the tool was doing the way it was intended to do, and that they also were in position of reducing the level of ISFC because the resource parents were no longer requiring that level of intensity to engage the youth, and the responsibility had been shifted to other providers, either a wraparound provider or someone else that was providing those services in the home that did not require the resource parents' commitment or high-level commitment of that time. So as I said, we will remove that criteria once we determine if it's the tool or the metrics before the full implementation. And metrics I'm alluding to is the points and the scoring, to make sure that that is not what is causing the problem. So just wanted to talk a little bit about that policy right now. Specialized care rates programs, those county SCI plans, they ought to be submitted. They're due now. There's no extension, so we got a boatload of SCI plans in yesterday. I think we're up to about 20 plans. So we are posting them on a flow basis. You got the instructions in our ACL 1848 about SCIs. During the delay, same process, keep your existing SCI rates in the process. So the new SCI rates won't be effective until we fully implement, that should say implementation of the LOC. So SCIs and the full implementation of LOC go together. So come August 1, if we don't have all of those SCIs, we can't move forward. So we really need those plans in counties. If you're on this call, we really need your SCI plans in. And if you have some kind of one-off situation with us, please email us or let us know, what your issues are to the SCI inbox. Okay, intensive services foster care. And we issued an ACL on this, which pretty much laid out the roles and responsibilities of the agency, of the resource parent, counties. We basically took what was in law and tried to, articulate it in our letter. We realize that there is still a lot of policy work that needs to be done, and it is our intention to convene a work group to work through some of those policy considerations. But for now, I need to remind people what ISFC was intended to do with respect to a rate. It is to support the intensive supervision activities that involve that resource parent. And that is how you get to ISFC from the rate perspective by using the level of care determination tool. Now, ISFC as a program is where we really need to square up what those parameters are and how that really works with the LOC determination. And we know that that is really where some of the confusion in the field is occurring right now. Number one, the ISFC rates being used for the status factor. So that's one level of confusion, which I hope I clarified. And then there's the ISFC rate as the IFC rate itself, which is can be utilized when you place young people in an ISFC with an ISFC agency. Those agencies, we have published list of ISFC agencies on our website. Those are the ones that have been approved, they amended their program statements. But this concept of growing one home at a time. So UFFAs that have not, and I know in the stakeholder meeting yesterday, it was surfaced about the concern and fear of taking youth that are stepping down from SCRTPs or kids that had risk factors like CSEC kids. I mean, the fact that you've not had the skill or the exposure or working with kids that have those kind of specialized needs is a concern. We understand that. But we also believe that if you think of ISFC as a way to grow one home at a time, where you've identified a willing and potential resource family home that's willing to take a young person, as long as you have the right supports and services in place while that caregiver or resource parent is building up their competency to manage the behaviors of that child in that home. I think folks are really stuck in their old way of thinking about the way ITFC used to work, and we want folks to get out of that box about growing families for ISFC in your FFA structures. That it requires a great deal of a great relationship that you need to build with your counties, and not a posturing of I'm entitled to an ISFC rate because I have an ISFC kid. We really need to look 360 degrees at a child or youth stepping down. You start early with planning before you discharge out of STRTP, making sure you're making those linkages to the right placements with ISFC programs. And if you're not counties who don't have FFAs or an ISFC FFA program in their county, I would encourage to think about the grow one home at a time concept, especially if you're placing kids with relatives. So this is where you're, establishing relationships with FFAs to help you with identifying the group of kids in your counties that need that level of service. So if it's with the option of county programs to provide the ISFC is an option if you do not have FFAs, or if you are choosing as a county to do your own ISFC program, then that's an option as well. To date, we've only got one county that I think has submitted a public model for ISFC, and I think that's Fresno County. But I really want folks to think differently about intensive services foster care and how you build those services for the young people that need that service. It's a relationship building approach, and it's not just the technical aspects of what ISFC is as a program model, but you really need to be at the table thinking about in the child and family team setting and figuring out what an intensive services model of support looks like for the young people that you're trying to serve in your county. So for those that have sent forward scenarios around ISFC and its interaction with LOC, I know that one scenario has come up where one county has identified X amount of ISFC youth as a result of their LOC determination, and have been unable to place those young people in ISFC settings. So we're going to be working with those counties and the FFAs to sort of bridge some of those conversations as to what the barriers are. You know, there's some brainstorming suggestions around, you know, getting your FFAs in the room, staffing those young folks, and figuring out what's the best path for providing those programs and building an ISFC home, one home at a time. So, so those are just some things to think about. And as I said, stay tuned for we will be convening a work group a work group to talk about ISFC policy in real time. So Rami asked me, when can we expect that work group? So I would say in the next couple of weeks, be sooner than later. But in the meantime, we're going to tease through these policy scenarios that we're getting from counties and FFA based on a case-by-case basis, so that we can just sort of knock out those barriers for those kids, those counties that are having those challenges. As I said, we're looking at all the scenarios that have been submitted to us, and we also are looking at what has been scored. And for those of you that are entering information into the CMS CWS system, we appreciate that, because we could at least administratively look into the system and start pulling those cases that have utilized the LOC tool, and be able to sort of make some qualitative determination about what's going on with the correlation with LOC and the characteristics of kids. There's a parallel conversation occurring right now with CANS and LOC, but it has nothing to do, I won't talk about that in this discussion today, because there's more things that we need to tease out internally, how at some point LOC and CANS will intersect, and how that process will work. So there's more conversation to be had for that. So once again, just want to reiterate that, you know, ISFC is not solely an FFA program. In counties, it's counties' options in terms of how they want to contract with FFA programs that are doing ISFCs. I know in some counties that's how they're doing ISFC, exclusively with contracting with FFAs. We've seen RFPs that are going out for that service. So it's up to the counties in terms of how they want to, you know, provide those intensive services for youth and resource families that have the ability and the capacity to come forth and do that, one home at a time, as I said. So we're reviewing that, and we'll continue to work with counties and our agencies on try to bridge those gaps. One suggestion is that, you know, in transition, as I said, the communication needs to be really clear prior to placement, the communication with the county. I think CFTs are the anchor to CCR. I think we really ought to, you know, make that one of the critical pieces or the critical steps when you're stepping kids down from STRTPs. I know we heard in the advisory meeting yesterday that a lot of times your intensive services agencies don't get access to the same material that our STRTP providers get, and that is something that we heard loud and clear yesterday that needs to be addressed, because I believe that you should be entitled to the same level of detailed information, especially when you're placing in a home. Though that is a home for a young person, and you know the climate there and the preparation to make those placements are real important, and you need the information so you can make an informed decision. So I'm encouraging more communication between agencies and counties before placements are made to be able to make the appropriate placement for this level of care. Keeping in mind that we do have intensive care coordination and intensive home-based services on the mental health side for intense needs kids. And counties and agencies need to keep in mind that you can have a resource parent who's being paid at the basic level and can still be receiving ISFC and IHBA services in that home, because it may be a relative or a grandmother says, look, I'm not doing all that stuff you want me to do, but I'm going to let my grandchild be here. So, bring the services here and give me what I need to be able to keep him here or she in my home. I mean, you can have those kind of scenarios too. So I just want folks to not think that all intense needs always are attached to this rate. It just really, that's why you have to have a whole 360-degree, that's what I think the Child and Family team provides, conversations about the placements and what supports need to really be in that home. The LOC is just one aspect of that conversation in terms of how folks get paid. So that's sort of the context for ISFC, and I will leave it at that and see if there's any more questions at the end of this presentation. Just want to say a little bit about the study. You heard that we did an iterated reliability study that was conducted and led in conjunction with UC Davis Resource Center for Family Focused Practice. We will be posting the study, and if you want it, you can request it through the LOC box, but we'll put it on the CCR webpage. Hats off to the 6 counties that participated. We had a total of 80 cases, with 53 in the sample where there were actual LOCs conducted, with findings of 72% reliability. The findings told us that we need more training on the protocol scoring, more training about how some of the determinations in the domains, which I spoke about earlier. So we're particularly reviewing the physical and permanency domains in terms of the challenges that we saw in the study around that and what we're seeing in the field too. So those are the things that we are working on in regards to the study. The question was asked about where did most of the kids land in that study. Of course, the higher percentage of kids did land in basic. And then we had percentages, of course, in 2s and 3s, and I think we only had 1 intensive service foster care level in that study. Okay, so I'm going to stop now and see if there are questions that I can specifically address. I know you guys have been typing up a storm, and so I'll let my staff see if there's anything specifically that I need to speak to.
So we do have a question.
Okay.
And it says, as an FFA provider of ISFC, we have 25 families who are ISFC approved. A problem we are running into is that our families have got into foster care to take care of children, and we have had families quit taking ISFC placements due to the fact that they are limited on the amount of children they can place in the ISFC home. This has also limited the counties we work with in placing children that they need placed. So
this sounds like a capacity question in terms of what the current capacity about 2 eligible children being allowed to be placed in an ISFC home, and they can't have more than 5 total. And then it was a question about unrelated placements unless they're siblings, if this is to that question. So the reason why we did not change anything with respect to capacity on the unrelated kids is that we still need to have a discussion about quality of care and the ability of resource parents to really support intensive needs kids with that high number of kids in their homes. So I'm not discounting the ability or capability of resource parents, but the quality of care, when you think about intense kids and the ability to add more kids than what you currently have out of the 2 that you're caring for that have intense needs. And, you know, those are things we need to have further discussion about what that looks like. And, you know, we need to be informed about, you know, what that quality of care looks like when you've got more than 2 intensive kids in a home and they're not a sibling group. Now, we've heard that FAs have reported that they may be at risk of, if you currently have kids in the home that are not in ISFC, so in that 5, you might have 2 eligible ISFC kids, and then of the other 3, that kid starts to elevate or escalate. The question of, are you going to be removing kids from a home because of the capacity limitations? And we would say that's not our intent. We would not, if you've been caring for that kid and they begin to escalate, then we would say what's going on in the dynamics of the home or what's happening with that particular kid. There's things that we would need to look at, and we would not encourage the county to be removing kids from a home where they've been placed. So I want to dispel that. If that's what's happening, then we need to have a discussion about it, and you need to bring it to the attention of Sarah, myself, or others who have been trying to engage in TA between providers and counties when those kinds of things occur. So we know what the law says in terms of the limitation of capacity, but we believe that we can develop a policy that makes sense about the quality of care. You know, so we're not trying to replicate where you have a home. You know, I just can't imagine a home where you got 5 intense kids, in the sense that and you are the resource parent caring for 5 intensive level kids. We would wonder what the quality of that care would be. So that's all we're saying. So there's more discussion that needs to be had with your resource parents, the agencies, the counties, and us about that model of care. And, you know, because in our minds, it feels like, are you replicating a small care home, or what is that? What is that model? So just more discussion about that is what we need, but we are definitely not advocating that kids get removed from a home where they've been just because their needs escalate. You need to bring more services in that home. You know, those are the kinds of discussions that we need to talk about. So I want to dispel that myth, and if that's what's occurring, then that needs to be brought to our attention. So I am acknowledging receipt of, you know, I've received stuff from FFAs about the potential of that happening. I've not heard where it actually happened, where a county has come in and said, I'm removing the kid because you can only have this capacity of intense kids in an ISFC placement home. I've not had it actually presented to us that has occurred. So if that's the case, then we need to know about that as soon as possible. Any more questions about?
Yeah, so real quick, can you talk about CANs and electronic charting for ISFC children?
No, I cannot. But we could take that question back to the CANs team, and we can interact and follow up with, you know, what might be the discussion around that, because we have just started to bridge that discussion about the interaction of LOC and CANs. We haven't gotten that far along. At the minimum, we're just trying to start that conversation with our subject matter experts about how that works. So it may be a while before we get to an answer around that piece.
Does a caregiver have to complete any specialized training prior to receiving static criteria? So
the static criteria assumes that you are placing with a caregiver that can at least keep that child safe minimally. If that caregiver is going to be the long-term placement for that child, per our letter, they have that time. They have a limited time span to get the training to continue to get that rate. So I'm assuming that if you're placing with someone under the static criteria, that person potentially has the ability to care for that youth on the short-term basis, and that's the only way that they were going to take that youth on a short-term basis. So I don't know if that's an emergency placement or if it was a relative placement. It really depends on the nature of that placement at the time that you're using the static criteria for that kid. So if you're unsure, then, give us a call, send us an email, give us a call, and let us work through it with you. So if you have some scenarios now or, some confusion around that, then let us work through that with you. So we've got 5 more minutes for questions, and I can guarantee you that some of the things I said will be put in a letter, but this was just to give you a heads up of, especially around the delay, some of the policy questions that we've been getting around LOC and ISFC and the static criteria and the leveling up. Those were the main ones that I know that have been concerning to people.
And we'll be posting the webinar and the PowerPoint up on the LOC webpage.
Okay, that was Rami who just announced that we'll be posting the webinar, Q&As and other things on the CCR page. Anything else related to ISFC or resource parents? Okay. Well, I am going to then end my journey here for Friday, and thank you all for joining us, and I look forward to further questions, and we might make this a regular thing, during this next 30 days, because I know there's a lot of moving pieces that are occurring, so we might set up for a Friday morning chat. So thank you all, and have a great weekend.